Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Amy Privette Perko, CEO of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, an independent group with a legacy of impacting college sports policies to prioritize college athletes' education, health, safety, and success. During her tenure at the Knight Commission, the NCAA has adopted a number of their recommendations. The most prominent of these actions include requiring teams to be on track to graduate 50% of their players to be eligible for postseason championships, and revising its revenue distribution to include incentives for academic outcomes. Amy joins us today to talk about NIL, the realignment of college conferences, and the big dollars that are now flowing into higher education athletics. Amy, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
Good to have you back. It's been, about 8 months, a year since we spoke last?
Wow, it doesn't seem like it's been that long, but you know what they say, time flies, right?
Especially as you get as old as I am.
Well, and especially when you work in college sports, things have been changing week by week, and it's been flying.
Really? I never would have guessed that. So you're the CEO of the Knight Foundation, which is huge in college sports. For those of you who may not know you and your background, would you please kind of just give us a snapshot of who you are and how you got here?
Sure. Well, as you said, I'm CEO of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics, and we're basically an independent think tank for policies in college sports. Our sole purpose really is to focus on leading change that emphasizes college athletes' education, health, safety, and success. And we are funded by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. I was fortunate to be a college athlete. I played basketball at Wake Forest University and had a great academic and athletic experience there. Fast forward, I've worked in college sports for, I guess, now over 30 years. The University of Kansas, the NCAA, and then with the Knight Commission work.
Well, if I remember correctly, you're also part of the Wake Forest Hall of Fame for athletes, am I not?
Well, thank you very much. I was fortunate to have a great career at Wake Forest and really honored to be in their Sports Hall of Fame.
I'm curious, what sport did you play?
Oh, I played basketball at Wake Forest.
Okay. What position?
Well, I was primarily a shooting guard, played some point guard as well. And I played in the ACC when there were 8 teams in the ACC. Still just a quaint bus ride to our opponents. But the great thing about college sports, playing in the ACC, playing at Wake Forest, was really kind of my first personal lesson in terms of how you can set a goal as a young child and work towards achieving that goal. Because as a young kid growing up, I always wanted to play. That was my dream, to play in the ACC and to play at Wake Forest. And that came true for me. And
you did a pretty good job while you were there too.
Well, thanks. A lot of great memories. It's been really just amazing to have been. I don't consider myself old, but looking back, I really was on kind of the ground floor, if you will, of Title IX, money being put into women's sports at the college level, and just seeing how much it's grown. Seeing the success from Olympic sports all the way, the Olympic teams and the women's teams at the Olympics, to all the success in more recently here, college sports and viewership numbers really off the charts, and just, seeing ultimately though, how many opportunities that young girls and young women have to play college sports have just grown so exponentially. It's really been wonderful to see.
We've come a long way, haven't we?
We have, and still long ways to go, but we have seen, just tremendous growth.
It is. And it's really good to see. I can remember initially, my undergraduate was at the Naval Academy, which we've talked about, and they brought women in for the last 2 years I was there. It was the first class, 1980 was the first class of women, and
Mhm.
having the women's sports there as well, and just to see them to where they've grown is really, really nice to see.
Absolutely. And with the higher education audience, we have to look at what is the mission of universities, and it is to help young women and men achieve their human potential. And sports is one way in which they can do that. Again, it's just so important to provide those equitable opportunities for women and men in sports.
Absolutely. And one of the things that saddens me about sports right now is it's turning into so much about money, which you've been right there at the forefront of seeing that. The last time we chatted, we talked a lot about the money in sports. Today, we're going to talk about that as well. But just to kind of get started, there's been some new things that have happened on the NIL front.
Yeah, and NIL, it's really interesting with the name, image, likeness rules, and that's what NIL stands for. Really has been the biggest changes in college sports in our lifetime. And it not only impacts, those schools and athletes that are in the headlines more nationally, those big power programs, but also, Division 2, Division 3 athletes can all benefit from the changes with NIL rules. We're in the 2-year anniversary, and the rule changes have allowed athletes to earn compensation for the use of their name, image, likeness, to be involved as influencers on social media, to be involved in endorsements. And frankly, those opportunities have also led to some real life lessons about the business of sports, kind of the finances that come along with it. So there've been some real positives. There are also some challenges, and we can talk about those, but just briefly, the challenges range from recruiting inducements, particularly among the powerhouse programs that haven't been enforced, even though that's kind of a basic principle of the NCAA, that there not be recruiting inducements with NIL, and that there also be protections for athletes so that, for instance, a common contract so that athletes know what they're getting into, more or less. The new NCAA president, Charlie Baker, has been pushing real hard to have some of those protections like a common contract and agent registration. But frankly, it's going to probably take federal legislation at this point. So that's another challenge, just the need for uniformity. It's amazing how active a number of states have been in passing state legislation, really to give their state a one up on other states with regard to NIL rules. So, we'll see when Congress comes back in session and starts working again, whether they will. There's been a couple of bipartisan drafts circulated on some legislation, so we'll see how that moves forward.
That'll be interesting to see. The other piece with that is something that just, I think, came out of California just recently about having athletes as employees of the college. I'm sure you're following all that.
Right. And it's very interesting because California, go back 2019, California was the first state to pass an NIL rule change, the state legislation. And the California legislation on NIL actually triggered the movement and led to the change that ultimately occurred. So everyone's watching California as, would that be a thing to come moving forward? But changing the ways in which, the California legislation puts forward. Again, it's really directed to a really small subgroup of schools that are earning lots of money. But it also, what's happening in those schools has painted an unfair picture, I think, about what's going on at really hundreds of other schools that, still have, athletics are really part of that educational mission and not kind of the entertainment industry, if you will, that it's become at the larger, higher profile schools.
Hmm. Just pulling out your crystal ball, where do you think it's all going to go?
Oh, it's really hard to say right now, but one of the things we're looking at, and we had CliftonLarsonAllen do some projections for us, and we have a report actually we'll be releasing just next week that really looks at, where is this headed for particularly the top programs and the top public institutions. Looking at 54 public institutions, all the revenues coming in now from the college football playoff, these new conference media contracts that have been renewed and expanded and are more lucrative. But the projections are staggering. We're looking at potentially from all sources, athletic revenues for those 54 schools that would reach 16 billion annually in 2032. So 10 years out, it would double where things are now. But again, you're looking at the college football playoff, just that championship itself. It currently brings in around $600 million a year. They're looking at expanding it, and TV executives believe that it'll draw north of $2 billion a year. So again, the big question that we're raising with our new report is, where's all this money going? How is it going to be spent? And, that's really the debate moving forward, particularly for these powerhouse schools, is, are we going to be moving to, at least in some sports, more of an employee model, some type of revenue sharing model, and what's going to happen with all the other sports? So I think the next 5 years are going to be even more significant changes moving forward.
Well, it's kind of hard to think they'll be even more significant than they are with all the conference realignments that are going on.
Well, the conference realignment has been, again, it shows where the focus of the university presidents has been, and it has been to position themselves in a conference affiliation that provides a large media contract. So how much revenues is this conference going to distribute on an annual basis? The Pac-12 schools have been in the media most recently. 6 public institutions in the Pac-12 announced they would leave the Pac-12 to join 2 other conferences, a Big Ten and the Big 12, really because those conferences had more significant conference media packages. And the pursuit is for, in those conference TV packages, 85% of them are really tied to big revenue football. So this is really about what one sport is going to produce and making a decision based on that versus what's, at least in our view, what's in the best overall interest of all sports. The recent decisions of the Pac-12 schools actually are reminiscent of a moment in 2011, more than a decade ago, when the first big realignment announcements were made, when Texas A&M and Missouri left their longtime rivals in the Big 12 to go to the SEC. And we had a night commission meeting where this issue came up. And at the time, Michael Martin was chancellor at LSU. He made an amazing remark looking back at the time. And he said then, this is 2011, he said, "I think that this is far from over." And he said, and I quote, "I think we will end up with 2 enormous conferences, one called Fox and the other called ESPN." Make no mistake, those TV partners have played a key role in all the realignments that have occurred since, and the most recent ones involving really what is the dismantling of the Pac-12, which is a 108-year-old conference.
Yeah. Well, I would have to say that remark was very prescient.
Absolutely, it was. Absolutely. And, again, if you look at how this played out with the Pac-12, Washington and Oregon only left the Pac-12 to go to the Big Ten because the Big Ten TV contract majority is with Fox. Fox is the 60% owner of the Big Ten network. And Fox said to the Big Ten, "Here's more money if you get Oregon and Washington." That left the other schools to go to the Big 12. But, again, moving forward, at least from the Knight Commission's view, that particular realignment, although it's not the first of its kind, they've been happening before, but again, they've been happening for football money, and that's one sport. The realignments may work well for football, but frankly, they don't work well for all the other sports and the hundreds of athletes who will spend more time on travel, miss more classes with cross-country competitions instead of regional contests. And for all the money that's gained through those conference media deals, there's a significant portion that now are going to be spent on travel costs. So, in the long run, we think there's better solutions out there. And one of our basic solutions is there should be a governing association for football that's separate from the governing association. The NCAA can continue to govern all the other sports for which it controls the championship. And the reason that can impact, we're not saying dismantle all of the conferences and start over, But the current rules are restrictive. So they say to FBS conferences like the Pac-12 or the SEC or the ACC, you have to have at least 8 schools that play this big time football. And they also have to play a specific number of men's and women's basketball contests against each other, a specific number of Olympic to get an automatic qualifier to those tournaments. So it's very restrictive in the affiliations and multi-sport requirements. So by doing it the way we've suggested, the football affiliations would be football affiliations based on, they could still be the same conferences, but you would not have to be tied to having those same affiliations in all the other sports. We've actually dubbed it the National College Football Association, should be the new entity in charge of football, and it should be funded by the College Football Playoff, which a lot of people don't understand, but the College Football Playoff is already independent of the NCAA. It generates its revenue separate from the NCAA. It does distribute the revenue back to the conferences, the FBS conferences, and then they send it to the schools. But the NCAA receives zero in revenue from FBS football and from the College Football Playoff. And that's significant because the NCAA, however, does absorb legal costs for the sport of FBS football. It absorbs about $60 million a year in national cost for that sport. And just moving forward, I mean, no one would build a structure that way. It's just grown over time. And so when they created the College Football Playoff, which still is a relatively new championship, it started in 2015. That's when they should have made the break and really started from scratch on the governance and everything else. But now we've got to do it moving forward. It's the CFP soon to be generating $2 billion a year, which will be double what the NCAA budget is.
So what's stopping this from happening?
What's stopping is what usually stops things from happening, and that is
Money?
self-interest of those that are in charge of the decision making. You know, the system right now, the most powerful conferences in football are the SEC and the Big Ten, and the system works quite well for them. You know, again, what we propose, we think it is better for the sport of football. It's the most powerful sport, generating the most revenue, but yet its leadership is fragmented among power conferences. There's no kind of unified structure. So our solution, we feel like, will be better for the future of football, better for football players, but also much better for all the other sports. And so ultimately, to get it done, university presidents will need to tell conference commissioners, we want you to work together to figure this out for the collective good of the whole. Or it would take, because Congress, you know, the NCAA and these conferences have asked Congress for help. So perhaps lawmakers will say, seems like you need a better structure here.
I would guess, and this is purely a guess, I would guess that because of these large TV contracts, you've got schools that are being distributed $100 million for participating in a football. If the football goes to a separate conference, will all the conferences lose this kind of money? Is that part of the reason that's driving that? Or am I not understanding?
Yeah, I think part of the reason is that anytime you have millions of dollars tied up in TV contracts, it's hard to unwind the current system. But again, we're not saying for the national governing structures, you don't have to dismantle the current conferences at all. But ultimately, you could have, let's say, some different affiliations have more flexibility in the rules for competition and different affiliations. I think certainly looking way out, you potentially could have the other drawback is the power of the brand. You know, is it more important to be a Big 12 conference school in all sports or just in one or two sports? And so it's the power of the brand in this day and age that's also an obstacle. But again, I think it goes back to the question of what do university presidents want to achieve from college sports? And if it's just about the revenue from conference contracts and the power of the brand, then you have to change the structure of how you treat athletes in that structure. If the answer to the question is, well, we want to provide opportunities for our athletes to have these excellent experiences, then the decision making you have to be willing to leave a little bit of money on the table to then provide a regional competitive structure for the athletes that's reasonable over athletes flying cross country and missing, lots of classes and those kinds of obligations that really aren't consistent with what, at least right now, the principles say that college sports should be about.
Well, it makes good sense, especially when I think about the years when I was an undergraduate and I followed Maryland basketball significantly, and they were part of the ACC. Their travel schedule, the team would play 2 or 3 games a week, and that means if they were to go to a different conference and have to travel cross country for 2 or 3 games a week, how do they get an education? Does that really negate what they've gone to college for, or are they just going to college for basketball?
Yeah, well, and that's at the crux of this. Again, and we're talking about, out of Division 1 is more than 350 schools, and with these conferences that have become very geographically broad, we're really talking mostly about the FBS conferences, and there are about 130 of those schools. But again, their conferences really are based on what works for football. And so that's the principle of this is that should the college sports structure, and if we look at what's the mission of college sports, should the rules be restrictive then on centering everything around the sport of football for all the other sports? Shouldn't there be some flexibility? I mean, these are smart people in charge. The conference commissioners are very intelligent. And I just think if university presidents said to them as a group, we are competitors, but ultimately we're all trying to achieve the same mission for our universities and our athletes. So work together to figure out a better structure moving forward that's better than what we have now, and that it's not so restrictive on all the other sports and their regular season schedules.
Well, I guess I'm getting confused. I would think that it would make sense to have football in its own conference and then the other sports in whatever conference makes sense from a regional perspective, from travel, etc. But then you've got the football as the big money maker. And so how do you distribute that money? Does that stay with the FBS quote conference? Does that go to the regular conferences split up across the nation? I mean, that to me would be a major challenge on how to figure this out.
Well, sure, revenue distribution is always where, there are challenges, but again, the ultimately the money flows to the schools, so the money wouldn't have to flow differently in terms of how the what the institution makes, the institution's going to make for all its sports. But in terms of these national shared revenue distributions, so the college football playoff, as an example, the college football playoff determines its own revenue distribution, and right now 80% of the money flows to the Power Five conferences. Now that's going to have to change moving forward as well, because the Pac-12 may not exist. And now that you have, I think the Big Ten will have 18 schools. Yeah, the ACC has 14. So they're going to have to change their revenue distribution. So again, those are revenue distribution formulas, factors are certainly issues. Pro sports owners fight about it, figure it out. College sports leaders figure it out. But the question is, on what principle are we basing our revenue distribution? Again, that's where we go back to the solutions that we've said is all of these schools have signed on to an NCAA constitution that says these are the principles that drive why we sponsor college sports. So in our solutions, we've said then if that's the case, the incentives have to be tied to these constitutional principles. And that's how, the incentives and the revenue, the national revenue distribution should be formulated. There are some good aspects currently of the NCAA distribution, but there need to be some improvements. So again, I think, moving forward with the college football playoff, first and foremost, the revenues need to take care of their own cost, but there need to be some changes with that distribution. But let me give you another point, if I can shift it to kind of the spending and that's been happening because, as I mentioned, we had CLA, National Financial Services Firm, do an analysis of, with all this new money coming in and if spending practices stay the same, what is this going to look like? Football coaches continue to be one of the chief beneficiaries of the current system. And the data show that currently there are 9 schools in the power conferences that pay their 11 football coaches, the head coach and the 10 other kind of accountable assistants, if you will. There's a lot more than that on staff, but those 11 people are paid more than what the school is spending on hundreds of athletes, their scholarships, lodging, food, medical expenses, insurance coverage. That's happening right now at 9 of the schools. And moving forward, the projections show that's going to be the case at almost more than half, nearly half of the power schools. So like 26 of 54 power schools are going to be in that situation. And that's just a financial model that's incongruent with college sports. And it basically, really is a problematic, we call it a crossover point, where those lines cross of what you're spending on athletes and what you spend on those 11 coaches cross over. And that's the kind of principle that college presidents could say, we're going to do something different with revenue distribution, and we're going to withhold distributions from schools that have that crossover point. That would be perfectly legal to do that. It's the kinds of things that pro sports have put in place with luxury taxes and the like. And college sports leaders are just going to have to think creatively about those issues moving forward.
Would there be antitrust implications with something like that?
The antitrust implications would come if the NCAA tried to put in place some type of caps and restrictions. But if a conference decides to do that, withhold some of its college football playoff distribution to a school, the school can spend however they want to. But if they exceed that crossover point, they just are foregoing a portion of the conference distribution. And if that's done on a conference by conference basis, that's not going to violate antitrust.
Well, it still is shocking to me that college football coaches make as much money as they do. They're usually their highest paid public official in a given state, but then making far more than the university president, who really has far more responsibility. I don't know. It's shocking to me.
It's even more than that in that, now we're looking at the assistant coaches, the coordinators, and what they're making. And the agents really have a lot of more power in college sports than really they should. And a lot of the contracts are consolidated among a handful of agents. So it's really everyone says, well, it's the market, but it's a very distorted market because tampering is allowed, and there have to be some other solutions. That there are solutions out there that they haven't tried. And so again, I think that's where the university presidents should prioritize these issues and ask their very smart conference commissioners, say, here are the issues we want to attack. We want you to work together and come up with some solutions for us in these areas.
Well, as usual, fascinating conversation. We've come to the end of our time way too soon. I'm going to change it up just a little bit. Normally we do, 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards, but I'm going to start with, what are 3 takeaways that we as a society, and specifically legislative bodies, Congress, the Senate, need to be thinking about when they start to address these things on a bipartisan basis, hopefully?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think overarching is, what do we want college sports to be for our young people is number one, but then within that kind of 2 sub questions, is it time to kind of separate out a segment of those universities that are competing at a different level of finances than the others? And then, secondly, what are the types of financial accountability tools that can be considered for college sports that haven't been considered? And that's where we've put forward those solutions. And then third, it's time to think more boldly about the right structures. Everyone agrees that the business side of big time college sports has accelerated so fast and so quickly, and the structure through which all this is designed is really outdated. And so that's where, thinking more boldly about what is the right structure that's going to help universities and help college athletes.
Oh, those are great. Thank you. So now we'll go into our regular 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards.
So the takeaways for presidents and boards, again, I think number one with university presidents is to be clear, and boards is to be clear about what's your mission of your particular college sports program. And presidents and boards are going to have to choose, and we need to stay in this lane, or we're going to strive to be something else. Number two is really just educating themselves and informing, because so much has happened in college sports. It's hard for those of us even work in it to keep up, but the importance of understanding and informing themselves of the data and of the rulings that have impacted college sports. And, I'm going to stop with that, because I think number one, just being clear about what their mission is, I think that's where the problem lies, because there's a lot of confusion, I think, at the top about what they're really trying to achieve in college sports. And if this is more about an entertainment industry for their university, or is this about opportunities for college athletes?
Very good. What's next for you? What's next for the Knight Commission?
Well, as I said, we've been working really hard on this financial report with CliftonLarsonAllen on projections, and we're putting that out next week. And we think it should have a big impact, again, on really putting forth some powerful historical data. It's based on fact about where college sports is headed if there are no changes. So we think the big impact that this report will make is to shift leaders' focus from, again, chasing revenue to making decisions about how to change how the money is being spent. There's enough money coming in. It's really a question of how that money is being allocated.
Mm-hmm. And, we've had the conversation before that the money really isn't going back to the schools to improve curriculum, more faculty, et cetera. It's more self-sustaining for the athletic program.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there are some, but very, very few schools actually send money back for academic and university purposes. And one of our members, Eric Barron, the president emeritus of Penn State, wrote a great op-ed back in March that basically challenged the CFP leaders to earmark money that will be coming in now that the CFP is expanding, because of that cardinal rule of budgeting, that it's much easier to reallocate new money coming in than changing the spending patterns based on the actual money at that time. So now that we know new money is coming in, this is the opportunity that leaders have to change and redirect where that's going.
Yeah. Let's hope it happens. Amy, this has been wonderful. Thank you again for coming back on the program. It's always a pleasure.
Great to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening today. And a special thank you to today's guest, Amy Privette Perko, CEO of the Knight Commission on Collegiate Athletics, and for her sharing with us what's going on with athletics and the key decisions that boards and presidents will need to make going forward. Tune in next week when Camille Dumont, Director for the Center for Career and Professional Development at Post University, joins us to talk about the great things they're doing to ensure their graduates are career ready. Thanks again for listening. See you next week.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode, at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.